Hello, everyone. I see people starting to filter in. Welcome to the webinar. Yeah, these numbers are climbing up really quickly. Okay, we're going to get started in just a minute or two while we let kind of everybody come in. But in the meantime, we would love to hear a little bit more about where you're all from. So if you want to kind of pop your name and your organization and your location in the chat, we would love to get to know you all a little bit better. Oh, we have somebody from Kamloops in BC, Vancouver. We're gonna have lots of our Canadian friends on the webinar today, which is exciting. Oh, from London, Ontario. I think I saw somebody from Hamilton as well, Bruce. Alberta, somebody from Ottawa. Amazing. Oh my gosh, they're coming in so fast. I can't even see them all. That's exciting. Okay, well, welcome everyone. I think we're gonna get this show on the road. So first of all, thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. My name is Meredith. I am Keela's head of marketing. We also have Kim, Keela's partnerships coordinator, helping us out today. You might see her in the chat box or answering some of your technical questions. So feel free to say hello to Kim. And before we get started, I just want to start this session today by acknowledging that Keela's head office in Vancouver is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and give thanks for their generosity and hospitality on these lands and waters. So if you are new to Keela, welcome. Keela is a complete donor management and fundraising platform that helps you deepen donor engagement, track your fundraising progress, and most importantly, raise more for your cause. And just before I briefly introduce our speakers today, I just have a couple housekeeping items to go over. So today's session will be about 40 minutes in length, followed by a Q&A at the end. And throughout the presentation, please feel free to write any additional questions that you have in the chat box or in the Q&A section, and we're going to get through as many as we can. And I know a ton of you submitted questions during registration as well, so that is great. We will get through as many as we possibly can. And with that out of the way, I am excited to welcome our speakers today. Bruce MacDonald is the president and CEO of Imagine Canada and has spent a number of years working in the nonprofit sector, including nearly 20 years as the president and CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters. And then along with Bruce, I'm excited to welcome Megan Conway. With over 20 years of diverse leadership roles in government and the charitable, voluntary, and academic sectors, Megan is currently the president and CEO of Volunteer Canada. So thank you both so much for joining today and sharing these really valuable insights with the group. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Bruce and Megan.
Sounds great. And Meredith, that was kind. When you get to be my age and people introduce you and they say a number of years, that's really nice. So yeah, thank you so much, Tequila, for hosting this, and I think it's going to be a terrific conversation. And certainly, judging by the number of questions that came in beforehand, there's a lot of interest in this topic. It's wonderful to see people from. I've seen at least two coasts, and I haven't been tracking all of them, but there may be the northern coast as well, and colleagues in the United States. So fantastic to see such a wide range of folks joining us today. So as we kind of kick off, as we were preparing for this webinar and this conversation, it was interesting that it's almost exactly 3 years ago that the world came to a grinding halt with the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's wonderful that Megan is here as kind of a sage, wise voice for what's going on in volunteerism, certainly in Canada. And I don't know, Megan, if you've got sort of global perspectives, but let's kick things off with kind of a macro view. Now that we're at the 3-year mark, from your perspective, what is the state of volunteering, certainly in Canada? And if you have any perspectives globally, please add them in as we just sort of kick off the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. And it's so great to see everyone here from across the country in Canada. And I saw a few people joining from the United States as well, which is fantastic. And I'm coming today from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe people. And I'm really happy to have the opportunity to have this conversation with Bruce and to answer some questions. At Volunteer Canada, we often think about the state of volunteering by thinking about what the past has looked like and also a little bit about what the future might look like. But Some of what we track is we talk about before COVID, and it's hard to believe we're coming up on a 3-year anniversary, but we talk about the fact that before COVID, 79% of Canadians volunteered formally, or either formally or informally in some ways in their communities. And that data comes from the General Social Survey of Giving, Volunteering, and Participating. And that survey is done, that last survey was done in 2018, and we're going to see another survey come out shortly. Many of us at this moment in time have adapted throughout the pandemic. During the pandemic, we know that 61% of organizations said that they experienced a decline in volunteers, either the raw numbers of volunteers, they saw a shift in volunteer roles, and they saw a decline in volunteer hours. And so we know that that has meant major impacts in organizations throughout the pandemic. And as we start to emerge out of it, we're seeing some new trends as well. So one of the things we've done recently, Bruce, that I'll just highlight is we surveyed 61 volunteer centers across Canada. And we're seeing that volunteer centers are a really important resource in communities. And I'm giving a special shout out. I saw some folks on the call from Volunteer Ottawa and Volunteer Manitoba and from places across the country. Volunteer centers are a really critical part of Canada's volunteering infrastructure. So we see them playing really important roles in their communities as connectors, as providing resources and tools, and in helping address some of the localized issues and challenges that communities are seeing around how to engage and recruit and retain volunteers. But in the survey of volunteer centers, one of the things I'll talk about is that 61 volunteer centers that were surveyed, less than half of those had stable revenue. 19 had volatile revenues, and 12 had unstable ones. And we're hearing signs from across the country of volunteer centers closing because their revenue base is limited. So, I mean, that's a really problematic concern from us at Volunteer Canada. But I think most currently, like at the current moment in time, one of the things I would draw everyone's attention to is there was some really great research done in the from Statistics Canada in the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions, and it came out in November. And of those organizations that were surveyed, 32% reported an increase in demand for services. So we know that there's a high demand in communities for services because of things like inflation, because of volatility coming out of the pandemic, and people maybe have lost jobs or maybe haven't found the same level of economic security. So there's an increased need for services. Alongside that, of the organizations that were surveyed, 65% of organizations indicated that they had a shortage of volunteers. And 54% of the organizations indicated that they had challenges in recruiting or retaining volunteers. And that over 30%, just over 30% of the organizations said that they had to reduce or close down their programs. And so we're talking about it as a dual crisis in volunteering at the moment, Bruce, because people have not returned in the ways they maybe previously have. And we know that there's lots of reasons for that. But that we're quite concerned organizationally and at a sectoral level around how do we re-engage volunteers? How do we get them back into their roles in volunteering? And how do we think ahead to the future of how we might do that collectively as a country? And there was some, media in January that spoke to some organizations that are having to close down their operations or having to shut down programs. And so we're regularly talking to our members or to other organizations across the country who are strategizing and try to figure out how do they continue to provide services given this dramatic shift. And I think some of this, Bruce, has been, there's been technological shifts, there's demographic shifts, there's economic shifts that have happened in the pandemic. And I think we need to come together collectively and figure out how we're going to strategize as a sector and as communities to really bring people back to volunteering and to celebrate the ways that individual volunteers are contributing.
Yeah, it's a great opening and sort of scene setting. I know in the work that I feel very fortunate to be able to do with Imagine Canada, when we're talking with organizations, these two ideas flip as the top two concerns, as they're in this context that you mentioned about serving increased demand. One is people and talent, and that's both paid and volunteer, and the other is the prolonged period of inflation that's affecting a lot of their costs. I know when we were preparing for this call, we were talking about the fact that, even the coming together of those concerns, that for many organizations, losing their volunteer coordinators was one of the very first things that happened in the pandemic. So that didn't affect just the volunteer side, it was also affecting the staff side. And so we're going to deconstruct this a little bit and have some questions along some themes now before we get to the questions that people have sent in or have for us today. So for many organizations, older adults have been the backbone of their volunteer force for years. And so maybe you could just provide us with some insights as to what you're seeing with older adult volunteers as we hit this 3-year mark.
Absolutely. And so data again from the GSS GVP talks about seniors being that demographic who have historically given the most amount of time. So they've really been the ones that have leaned in big ways through the number of hours they've contributed to causes or organizations and communities. And what's happened in the pandemic, we've noticed and we've heard anecdotally from our members and from various partners across the country is that seniors in particular are not returning in the same ways that they did pre-pandemic. One of the great data points we've identified, it comes from Volunteer Victoria, which did some research in 2022, which talks about some of the deep reasons why seniors are reluctant to return to volunteering. One of the reasons is a very basic one. Seniors are very concerned about health and safety risks. And so for seniors, they really need to have a sense of strong trust and strong commitment from the organization that those practices around health and safety are going to be maintained. And so, I think there's lots of things organizations that are progressive are really thinking about doing and modeling around how to re-engage those senior volunteers. But I do think that health and safety piece as a very basic connection is really important for organizations to think about. And another piece of that is a little bit of a technological piece for seniors. While many seniors are very adept at virtual elements, there's also just the new adaptation of technology that seniors have to think about doing. The one thing I would say or identify or articulate is we're seeing seniors are still very passionate as activists. We're hearing, we have anecdotal data around the ways seniors are getting involved directly more in direct causes and activism in their local communities, whether that is protest or rallies around specific causes. Seniors are showing up for those pieces, but they may not be returning directly to their organizational volunteering roles as they have in the past. So that is a concern also, and we need to think creatively around how do we collectively re-engage seniors and ensure the health and safety pieces are really solid so that they're feeling safe in those volunteer roles.
So now we're going to go to the other end of the spectrum, and I'm going to weave in a preset question with one that's come in the Q&A box and one in the chat box. So the preset question that I'll add in the other two parts is, let's look at issues facing, young people as they seek to engage. And from your perspective, what are the main things that organizations need to keep in mind as they seek to connect with young people wanting to contribute their time? And so in the chat box, there was a question about under 30. And in the Q&A, it was specifically addressing teens. And I don't know if there's any nuances that you might want to weave in there.
Sure, those are great questions, Bruce. One thing I would say is that we know that many of the youth volunteering roles that may have existed were the ones that were often cut right away in the pandemic. So there weren't as many opportunities for, volunteering ceased across the board in the early stages of the pandemic in many instances, as things were shuttered for periods of time during lockdowns, but that the youth volunteering roles didn't come back on in the same ways. Youth, we know from data from the GSS GVP, volunteer in high numbers, but they haven't typically given large amounts of their time. One thing I would say is that Rito Hall Foundation has done some great research from 2021. And so you can go to their website and pull some of that. And in the data they've pulled, one of the key statistics I pay attention to is that 55% of young people in Canada say it's been more difficult to connect in their community since the start of the pandemic. So that's a pretty significant number, Bruce, and it's a worrying number in terms of what that means from a future perspective around if young people are not having those touch points or have not been socialized around what it's like to volunteer and to contribute in their communities at early ages. What are the downstream impacts of that? One of the other pieces of data that I would point to from Rito Hall Foundation is that 70% say that their definition of community changed. And 74% of youth surveyed said that the location is less important to them or to how they define community during the pandemic. So this notion of youth contributing virtually and also thinking about causes is another key theme. So that's a theme that we find is spanning both ends of the spectrum. Cause-based volunteering and issue-based volunteering is definitely something that we're seeing as being on the rise. And that's creating challenges for your frontline serving organizations that are reliant on youth to do things like mentoring, or volunteers to mentor or to do work at food banks, etc. So some challenges there for sure. We're also seeing organizations come forward and say, we actually need to have better data about what it's going to look like or take to do better youth engagement and senior engagement in volunteering. And so this lack of data, we really are appreciative of the business conditions survey from StatsCan and the GSS GBP. But at a sectoral level, without really granular data about what's happening around how to re-engage volunteers and around how to bring them back, data that's not only just at a macro level, but also at the level of place and community and demographic. We don't have that kind of insight necessarily around how do we problem solve and come up with solutions that are meaningful in a really robust way. So we're really working hard with the federal government around some data advocacy pieces, because we do think there's some important data pieces that are missing around how to really rethink some of these issues around how to engage different demographic groups. I would also say that many youth serving organizations and other organizations who engage youth are articulating some challenges around this question, around how do we do a better job of engaging youth. And I'm hearing this from a lot of partners that both youth serving, but also those that engage youth as volunteers, there is a way in which we seem to not have that level of detail that we need to do a better job of this moving forward. So I think this is an issue that's going to require a bit of a collective lift. I think I think there's an opportunity in the Canadian context to think about what would it take to have a national call for service and participation for youth. What would it take to engage or re-engage youth in participation at a national scale, and what are the ways we could do that collectively? I'm seeing some great comments in the top chat too.
I was just going to say the same thing. There's some great points coming in the chat.
It's hard for me to keep up on all the comments in the chat, but there's great comments there. And someone's flagged a really important piece here, which is that there are hidden barriers to participation in volunteering, right? And some of those are cost related. And so we're working hard to try to identify ways we can address some of those at a collective level or at a bigger scale. And we know that volunteer centers in their local communities are doing some really innovative work to problem solve what are the barriers to volunteering and participation that might be hidden barriers, or that may not even be hidden, but just may not be ones that have been prioritized to be addressed. So those are some important points there also.
Yeah, great stuff. I mean, maybe just a couple other sort of observations. I mean, it's interesting too how you talk about barriers to volunteering, and I think one of the things we've seen writ large is that the pandemic has, and now this period of prolonged inflation, has shone a spotlight on inequality in our country, and I guess for our American counterparts as well. I would extrapolate that south of the 49th parallel. And it's interesting because when you think about then the ability to participate as volunteers, if there are economic and financial hardships that are being borne by families and borne by people who might be interested, that's something that we certainly need to address. And the other one that sort of struck me as you were talking was even thinking about the implications of the disruption of school environments. In many Canadian provinces, there are requirements for civic participation in order to graduate from high school. And during lockdown periods, those were fundamentally disrupted. For many young people, that might have been their first exposure to volunteering in their communities. And so there has been a period of interruption. So just to give you a heads up, because I love to sort of go off script here. So I'm going to come to the next question, but I did notice one in the chat or the Q&A box around is there legislation or public policy work that might encourage volunteerism? And I know Volunteer Canada is doing some work on a national strategy. I'm going to give you a moment on that one. Sure. But before we get to that question, you had raised the point of technology and virtual volunteering. Mm-hmm. And, during the pandemic, especially in those early days, organizations moved quickly to adapt and shift their engagement opportunities with volunteers into a virtual space. And we really saw that too when there was lockdown periods. Now, what's happening with virtual volunteering now that for the most part, restrictions have been relaxed?
Yeah, and what we're hearing from our partners and from volunteer centers and our members is that virtual volunteering is here to stay, Bruce. We had noticed the trend in the pandemic that as organizations went to their contingency plans and reimagined how they were going to deliver services, the virtual element became critical in the pandemic, and that we're seeing even in this post-pandemic period, virtual volunteering is definitely not going anywhere. And so there's been an adaptation to the virtual piece of volunteering. And also there's many roles that can't actually be replaced by virtual volunteering. You know, when I think about the very far edges of what the future of volunteering might look like, I start to wonder about, what's the role for AI in this moving forward? You know, that's a big question, Bruce, and not one that I have the answers for today, but it's one that I puzzle over a little bit as I think about, and I'm not going to say it right, but chat GBT. You know, I think about how is it that we might get really creative around what virtual volunteering might look like, and how might we be able to think about the role that human relationships play, and what's the role for technology in that. And I think those are bigger questions and not ones that I necessarily have answers for today, but I do think we're starting to see some shifts and some edges being challenged around virtual volunteering. The other piece I'm going to say is, this is sort of a paradox. The paradox of all of this is that the more you stay at home in front of the screen, the less you actually know about your community and what's going on in community. And we're really hearing about the importance across from all of our partners around this return to basics, and the return to reconnecting in our community, and the return to the value of actual human connection and awareness around social issues that really matters. I think we've learned in the pandemic that technology can do lots of good things, and it has certain limitations that we need to really be mindful of. And especially in volunteering, you know, people want to reconnect with one another directly. This year's theme for National Volunteer Week, and I don't want to go off on a tangent, Bruce, because I know we're on a tight timeline, but this year's theme for National Volunteer Week is Volunteering Weaves Us Together. And it's really about the way that all of us have so much to contribute to in our own communities, and how through volunteering, we are reconnected and woven into our community in so many ways. And volunteering is non-hierarchical, and it's a way for people to participate in all walks, forms, and shapes of life. So we're excited about this year's National Volunteer Week, which is April 16th to the 22nd. And, you know, just that notion of connection, really connecting with one another, connecting to our communities, and the sense of actual physical connection is really something that's virtual volunteering is wonderful, but you actually need to kind of connect with one another beyond screens also.
There's so much to unpack in here. It's so interesting. One comment I will make before I move to the question around sort of public policy and legislation is, I was looking at a global study on how people around the world are dealing with this issue of kind of permacrisis, the Collins Dictionary word of the year for last year. And one of the things that I'd seen an article on was talking about the fact that one of the best things that leaders can do is provide some measure of connection and stability in what feels like a constant hurricane. And the points that you were just making about how volunteerism can play that role, can be that thread to others in a period when so much is uncertain. It may be a way to be a very helpful measure as people think about their own health and well-being, their own participation, their own engagement.
Totally, Bruce. I couldn't agree with you more. And we are at Volunteer Canada really talking about how volunteering and volunteerism is the opportunity for us to reknit ourselves back to our communities and to one another. And this notion of, you know, we've become disconnected as Canadians, and I've said this before, but we have become somewhat disconnected and somewhat polarized. And we really firmly believe, and it's borne out in a lot of research, that volunteering offers the opportunity to reconnect in ways that I think are powerful for us as a country as we move forward. So we're really optimistic about thinking about volunteerism and participation. We talk about how might we build a radically inclusive movement around volunteerism and participation, and how can we contribute and recognize all forms of contribution, whether it be the kid next door who is shoveling that senior's you know, driveway and has done so every day in the pandemic, or the senior volunteer who has dedicated, you know, 300 hours to volunteering at the food bank. All of those forms of volunteerism and participation are relevant and important, and we need to find a way to lift up and celebrate all of them.
Absolutely. great points, Megan. So I come to this question around sort of policy, federal public policy work, and I'm going to weave together two that I've seen in the chat window here. One is, is there legislation around volunteering that should be updated or modernized, or is there new legislation? I'm now expanding a bit that should be introduced, and also then bringing together this point around completion of community service hours for graduation work. Is there anything happening at a federal level to make this a requirement for all of Canada? Because at least in Canada, that is a provincial jurisdiction, and it's a provincial choice about whether to include that as part of graduation. So maybe you could speak broadly to thinking about the volunteer future as it relates to working with the federal government, public policy, legislation, tax credits, etc.
Yeah, sure. So I would say, just as a starting point, in the 2019 report from the Senate, we were named as the organization that should lead a national action strategy on volunteering. And as everyone knows, the pandemic upended some of that progress towards that, the development of that. But we are back on a path right now towards the need and the urgency around developing a national action strategy on volunteerism. We've had some very early stage contribution from a philanthropic partner to be doing the development of at least a roadmap that would articulate what some of the opportunities and challenges are towards building a national roadmap or a national action plan on volunteerism. So we're today in the process. Our VP of Strategy and Impact, Chad Lubelski, is heading west and doing conversations across the country right now, where we're hearing from members and from partners in very small focus group conversations. And we're going to have an opportunity to gather much broader information from partners and a broader base of individuals coming forward. But we believe there's a real importance right now, and it's a once in a generation opportunity to actually, we just saw someone in the chat who attended. That's great. From Zara from Vantage Point. So that's great, Zara. We really think that's a once in a generation opportunity right now to really rebuild what Canada's volunteering infrastructure needs to look like, not just today, but for the future. And so, we could have a long conversation around some of the legislative gaps that exist and the lack of infrastructure that's driven from a federal policy perspective. But it's really an opportunity, I think, collectively for us to come together and to say we need to be working at these issues at not just a local community level, but at the federal, national level, and look at how there are some gaps in that infrastructure. So, we've had a lot of conversation around the importance or the need to modernize some of our screening practices for volunteers. We've had some active conversations with our colleagues in public safety on that matter, and that's going to require some investment to really rethink and look at what that would look like moving forward. We know screening is we have a handbook to screening and guidelines on screening on our resources that are as relevant today as they were when they were created. But the importance of modernizing some of those practices as we look ahead and thinking about what risk management looks like for organizations that are very small to the very large professionalized organizations. I mean, risk management is important no matter your size or the context of your work. You got to think through what that looks like, and how you screen volunteers is a really critical part of that puzzle. So I referenced screening, but I also think there's opportunities to think about what are the actual investment vehicles that are going to support voluntary action across the country now and into the future, Bruce. So, I think there's a lot of work that we have to do collectively. I know that many other jurisdictions like Australia, like Scotland and others have created national action strategies. One of the key pillars coming out of some of those strategies is really the need for enhanced and more robust data. So I think there's an opportunity here for us to be leaning into that. We're starting off on the path towards building it. We're keen to work with community partners and corporate Canada, as well as others, and other sector partners to help mobilize around that journey. And ultimately, it's going to require the government in some way, shape, or form to come to the table. And so we're really keenly talking to our government colleagues. We had a very good conversation yesterday, mapping out some of the issues. And we're going to continue those conversations and looking forward to others to jump in and help on that journey, because I think it's going to require a collective lift.
And I think it's great timing too. At least in Canada, we have a minority parliament, which means it could come to, the government could fall at any time, but there is some belief that it'll extend into at least late 2024 and maybe 2025. And having a national strategy to be talking with all of the main political parties about engaging in the next election debate will be critically important, because as clearly what's coming through in the chat and your comments as well, is how the very fabric of our society and our communities is enriched by having people who care about their neighbors. And in the sense, that's, you know, what volunteerism is all about.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, one of my colleagues talks about that the foundation for democracy exists in a caring relationship, and how do we actually build that into our policies and practices at a national scale? And I'm seeing people talk about the role of local municipalities. We think, and a cutting edge direction for us organizationally in collaboration with others, will be looking at the dimension of place in volunteerism as well, right? Because it looks very different if you're in Kamloops or if you're in rural Renfrew County than if you're in downtown Toronto, and the infrastructure looks different. So we have to think more creatively and be able to generate plug and play solutions that are going to be adaptive to the kinds of communities that exist in Canada. So I think it's not just at a national scale, it also has to be grassroots and local. And that one of the other pieces there are some jurisdictions, provincial jurisdictions across the country that are doing some very progressive things around provincial voluntary action strategies. So, you know, even Quebec, I think Quebec's has come to the end of it needs to be renewed, but there are some examples provincially that need to be looked at for sure. So we're excited to help or to lean on our provincial government counterparts also in the conversation. And I also think, Bruce, it's a time for us in the sector. We all, I mean, all of it, there's so many people on this call today. We all collectively care about these issues. There is an opportunity for us to come together in a collaborative, collective way to start to say the sector demands better and that volunteering demands better. I mean, if 58% of the sector is driven by volunteers, we've got some major challenges to really look at collectively. So I think we're all in for the challenge. I think we just have to figure out how we're going to actually mobilize change and decision-making is the question I have all the time. So
absolutely. And certainly we've seen where we have come together with strength, there's been success. So I'm going to skip a question and we'll hopefully come back to it, but I've seen a number of comments in the chat window related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or at Imagine Canada, we use the language of anti-racism and anti-oppression, and how important this is for so many organizations. So from your national vantage point, what are you seeing as it relates to DEI practices, or how organizations are integrating inclusion into their volunteer practices?
That's a really great question, Bruce. It's a big question for me to answer, but I'll try to unpack some of it and see what or identify what we're seeing organizationally and across the sector. So I think everyone that we speak with and that we're talking to agrees that there's more work to be done on this front. We're starting down the path and we're wayfinding, and we're doing it in partnership with those who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and those who are from communities who have faced systemic oppression, but that there's work organizations need to do to also support and invest in that journey. And I love the concept of how we can bring justice into the conversation. So how can we as organizations become more just in how we think about how to include volunteers from diverse ethnocultural communities? A couple of things that I would say, just high level, and I've said some of them maybe in the past, but one of the challenges I think in this conversation is language really matters. And so to that end, you know, within Indigenous communities, there isn't a word necessarily a traditional word for volunteering. And yet we know anecdotally that Indigenous peoples contribute in their communities in a ton of different ways. You know, I think about kokums or grandmothers and the role they play within Indigenous communities. And so I think we have to rethink how we talk about this a little bit within diverse ethnocultural communities. And you know, similarly within many Black communities, I've been told we don't talk about volunteering, we talk about mentorship. And I'm not saying, and one other thing I would say is I don't think there's a lot of nuance to the conversation. And I think we have to be mindful of context. Context plays a big role. And also there isn't just one answer to this problem. I would direct folks, we do have a series of resources on the Volunteer Canada website that I would direct folks to around diversity, equity, and inclusion practices specifically within a volunteer engagement framework or mindset. Volunteer Canada, in partnership with the Volunteer Centre Council, just recently launched Journey Towards Reconciliation, which is supporting organizations and really thinking about how they might embed reconciliation practices and some of the calls to reconciliation into their work. So I would just point folks to that resource on our website. I also think there's a real important role to be played in relationship building that moves beyond tokenism. And I think many of us are down that journey or on that journey, but it can't be tokenistic approaches. And I think, you know, it starts right from your board of directors all the way down to frontline serving volunteers, and that the way you treat all of those volunteers is critically important and needs to be reflected in your organizational values and in your strategies and in all of your approaches. The other piece I would say also is just this notion of being representative of the communities that you're serving is really critical. And I think too long, charities and nonprofits have adopted a outdated mindset in many ways around how they work with diverse ethnocultural communities. And if the pandemic and some of the calls for racial equity and justice have taught us anything, it's that we need to really get out of our heads, out of our minds in terms of how we deal with this work and how really engage more wholly in that journey. So we're on the path at Volunteer Canada, but we think there's a lot of other work that needs to be done, and we need to learn from allies who are leading that work in other spaces. We're not the experts necessarily. We're really leaning hard into some partnerships we're building and trying to learn from others. The other thing I would say, and this is we understand also that newcomers are often turning to volunteering as their first entree point into the Canadian labor market. And that we organizationally believe that there is an opportunity to rethink the volunteer to career pathway for newcomers in new ways that support that transition in ways that are really mindful of the journey that the newcomer's on, as well as what the expectations are on the organization that's supporting that volunteer. And that there's a real importance for us in terms of building strong relationships and strong connections and mentorship for those volunteers also that are coming from newcomer backgrounds. There's so many comments in the chat.
Oh, I know. I've done a lot of these. I don't know that I've ever been part of one where the chat Q&A has been as active. It's amazing. It's fantastic. So Megan, I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to one last question. So Meredith, I'm giving you a heads up because I'd love to be able to make sure that we get to questions that have come in here and in advance of the webinar. So Meredith, I'll be looking to you in a minute to see if there were any that you'd like to highlight that came in particularly from in advance of today's session. But just before I hand this next question to you, which will be really around sort of 2 or 3 recommendations or tactics that you might suggest, it's so interesting in terms of some of the comments that you were making. And I go back to my days at Big Brothers Big Sisters, and I see some folks online from that organization. And I also recognize that my best before date has expired as I've been gone from the organization for a long time. But one of the things that we were really looking at was even whether the program offering was culturally relevant to the changing nature of communities in order to attract volunteers. And so the model had been built for 100 years in a particular way. And it might be that there were, changes in the way that program needed to be imagined and delivered that would be culturally relevant and appropriate for growing parts of the community. And so I think this is about so many things: language, messaging, thoughtful, intentional engagement, but it may also be about program redesign as well.
Completely right. Bruce, I just want to underscore what you just said, and that trust and relationship building go a long way to solving problems, right? So, this concept of seeking to really understand through the conversations you're having with diverse ethnocultural communities is really critical. And that there's important data that organizationally we should be gathering that are going to help us on that path around adaptation and innovation to really ensure that we're meeting the needs of the stakeholders for whom we're serving, or delivering programs for.
Absolutely.
And with.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Last question before we turn to Meredith on this. So there's been a number of requests for, really tactical suggestions. And I know that there's no way you can do justice to all of the variety of questions that have come in, but we will ask you to solve all the problems with a couple of tips. So, what are 2 or 3 practices that you would suggest for organizations as they seek to offer kind of best in class volunteer experiences and rebuild their volunteer pools? Are there things that you see that could be common across subsectors and organizations?
Yeah, great question. And I think as I reflect on that question, and as I am mindful also of the comments in the chat, the one thing I think, to your point, we're not going to solve all the questions today, but I think the curiosity and the interest in coming together to collectively learn and ask the questions is really important. And And, check out our website. We've got lots of resources. The website, we're committed to redoing that website because it's got some challenges in terms of its look and feel, but there's lots of resources on the website, but volunteer.ca. So a couple of thoughts I have. One of which is we're seeing a trend where many organizations are investing in rethinking and prioritizing their volunteer engagement strategies. So at an organizational level, I think that's a really important tip that I would suggest is take a moment to step back and really invest in your volunteer engagement strategies. Connect with expertise is another really important comment. So if you have a volunteer center in your community, make a connection point with them, check out our website, go to different places to get information around how to do some of this work. And I'm going to give you more than 3. I'm sorry, Bruce, I'm breaking your rule. A couple of other things. So one of which is we're redirecting people back to some of the basic foundational guidelines and tools that we have. So the screening handbook is one. Another one relates to the Canadian Code for Volunteer Involvement. Go back to some of those basics. I love someone just put in the chat, hire skilled professionals to do the work. But make sure you've got the foundational pieces in place to be able to do the work in your organization, and listen and lean into their expertise. Find ways to leverage technology is another important tip we would offer. And then, really think about what are the meaningful, practical, relevant volunteer experiences you want to generate in your organization or in your context that are going to serve the population or the issue that you're addressing, and really think about how to build those meaningful experiences that are going to meet both the volunteers and the context or who you're serving. So just some high level stuff there. I love that, and the other piece is invest in volunteer management. We saw volunteer managers were the first ones that were cut in the pandemic. Many organizations are reinvesting in those roles, but we're not seeing them return in the same kinds of ways. And those roles really are senior leadership positions within organizations that need to be creative problem solvers to address these big challenges. They can't be sidelined or side a desk anymore. There's a bunch of appreciation thing going on in the chat. So it's great to be able to have that conversation and to hear from others who have got this kind of expertise also, because it exists across organizations across the country as well, Bruce. More than 3 answers, but hopefully there's a nugget.
All great stuff, and even great to see questions and comments coming in from, if I'm reading that right, Australia. So amazing. So Meredith, maybe we'll turn over to you now in terms of any prepared questions that you want to make sure that we address today.
Yeah, for sure. Wow. I mean, you guys said it, but this is probably the most engaged group I have ever seen on a webinar. This is amazing. So we did get a ton of questions in advance, and we've had some come in, so we'll try to get through as many as we can. So the first question is, formal volunteering has not returned. Is there any evidence of an increase in informal participation, for example, mutual aid? And how might the decrease in volunteer labor encourage investment in decent paid work in the sector?
So I hear 2 questions in that, and I'm going to unpack them. So the first question is, alongside a decrease in formal volunteering, has informal volunteering gone up? So that's question 1. And then the second part of that question relates to whether or not the push for decent work has shifted or restructured volunteer roles into paid positions. So I'm going to take those are the 2 questions. Yes. Okay. So what I will say is we know through data that informal volunteering in the pandemic was high. It did turn to things like neighbors helping neighbors. We saw that in many different ways. We will find more data in this next GSS GVP about what the rates of informal volunteering are. But one of the challenges we have as a country is we do not have great, robust data mechanisms to capture that data on more regular, recurring ways. So that's yes, we think informal volunteering has risen, but we also don't have the robust data to tell us that on a regular, routine basis. Does that answer that question, Meredith? We think it has, but we don't have the complete concrete data around that. And we believe that there's an opportunity for us for the sector to be paying more attention to that, because we think it's an important element of strong civically minded communities. And so the other question there is, I don't actually have data as to whether or not the push for decent work has resulted in more paid positions. Bruce might be able to answer that better, but I believe it's really important to clarify and classify organizationally what you're doing and what you're qualifying as paid work versus the work of a volunteer. there was great research that was put out in partnership with ourselves and ONN in the summertime, just looking at that delineation. So check out that research and that paper from ONN that came out in the summer about the classification of paid staff versus volunteers or employees, the difference between employees and volunteers. But my gut sense says, no, that's not actually, we haven't seen a large number of increased paid staff necessarily. I don't think that's happening. Bruce, I'm going to turn to you for that one though.
Yeah, maybe I can offer a thought on that. And just for those who maybe are, further afield from where we're coming from, ONN's on the Ontario Nonprofit Network, if you were looking that up. Just one thought to offer. One of the big comments that certainly I got in conversations with government and media during the pandemic and now during this period of extended inflation has been, why have core costs for organizations not been dropping? Even though some were saying we're having to stop programs right now because for whatever reason. And part of it has been that organizations have been requiring paid staff to perform functions that were previously done for by volunteers. And so it's resulting in staff burnout and exhaustion if they haven't been able to add to their staff complement. But I think through this process, I think it's illuminated the major contribution that volunteers make in our society, in our communities, and it's adding weight and credence for the need for stable, long-term funding for organizations so they can have both quality paid employment and robust, meaningful engagement programs, volunteer engagement programs. So I think collectively we need to continue to push this message forward that organizations need to be well funded to deliver meaningful services in their communities.
Yeah.
Okay, amazing. So I want to touch on, we have somebody here who has a question around technology. And I know we've mentioned technology a couple of times, but volunteer roles are changing as technology increases. What are some new volunteer roles that organizations are using that might inspire a return of older volunteers or spur some interest in some newer, younger volunteers?
So that's about the role piece to re-engage folks and the role of technology in that.
Yes. Yeah.
I think so. What we are hearing about is that there's a real emphasis on virtual volunteering as we identified, but that organizations that are getting really savvy about that are ensuring that individuals have the kinds of competencies, tools, resources they need to do that work effectively. So, the right systems in place, the right connectivity, the right ability to engage the demographic that they're serving through the tools and the technology that they have. I also think that there is lots of innovative stuff happening around even how you connect with volunteers, right? Like, are you texting them or are you Snapchatting them, or how are you actually talking to your volunteers? We're not doing this as much anymore with young volunteers, right? We're finding the quick technological solution to be able to connect with them through text messaging or through their, through some very easy way of connecting with them. So I think organizations that have got a little bit of capacity to innovate and try some of those tech solutions out are having some fun figuring that out. And then for those that are maybe don't have those same level of resources, I think some of the basics really just need to be in place also. So, if you're not relying on technology, that's okay. I don't want to shame and name orgs that don't have that capacity either, because, I think about hospital auxiliary associations. That work and they're largely older and they are largely also female, and they do great work in community, and they're largely hidden resources that are coming out of hospitals to support work in communities. Maybe technology is not the thing for that demographic, right? So that is a-okay too. I think it's not a one size fits all approach.
Great. Okay, we got a lot of questions about engaging younger volunteers, so I think that was a great tip. So the next one we have here is around someone would love to hear any ideas for professional development topics or opportunities for volunteers as a way to keep them engaged.
Oh, that's a great idea. So, we do talk and we do hear from organizations that where they're really successful at those volunteer engagement opportunities is where there's a strong relationship and they're able to really recognize the contributions the volunteers making. So For example, some young people, for instance, really want to have, I'm going back to a youth demographic, they may want to have the skills they've gained noted on their resume. They might want the reference letter, but they might also want, they may also want to take a specific course or have the training to support them in their volunteer role long-term. So we think that that's a really strong, strong suggestion, is to be able to support where it's possible, the training and the skills, and where it's absolutely needed, you have to make that investment and ensure that your staff have that level of training, or your volunteers have the level of training needed to be able to do that, to do the work that you're asking, or the volunteer role that you're asking them to do. There's so many comments in the chats here.
Megan, can I jump in with one comment?
Yeah, sure.
One of the other groups, and it did come up in one of the questions, was around boards of directors. And, you know, they're such a key volunteer-based group in our sector, because essentially they are the custodians of fiduciary responsibilities and strategy and those kinds of things. And as we think about professional development, I think we should also be mindful to say, what are the challenges in organizations today and tomorrow that we should be creating space at board meetings to have these kinds of conversations? And it might be about the changing demographic composition of the particular community that's being served. It might be dismantling practices that might be archaic, or barriers that are preventing volunteers from coming forward. So I think that as we think about the volunteer equation, there is a fair bit of weight that the board group holds, and doing development with them is often a worthy investment of time and energy.
Totally. And it speaks to the need to prioritize and put volunteer engagement and that focus in the organization as a leadership focus, not just at the side of someone's desk, but that work needs to be prioritized from the CEO or the leader right through to the board and to all staff. The one thing I was going to just pull out, and I wanted to just flag a comment in the chat that said, we shouldn't be continuing to focus the work of volunteers around the tasks, but also around the value that they bring to the work that they're doing. And that speaks to the need for us to be developing and building out measurement models that are going to support articulating the value that volunteers make in their organizations, in their communities, in their workplaces. But we need to really shift some of the narrative away from the task-specific focus on volunteers to the value that volunteers make. And it speaks to your comment also, Bruce. We have to start to collectively be able to articulate the ways volunteers matter in our communities and around service delivery, right? And I'm seeing it across the board right now, because we're talking about this from a perspective of crisis. And if we don't start to invest in volunteers and volunteering in bigger ways, we're going to have a bigger problem down the road. And in the short term, it's not the long term. And that whole comment you made around core funding is directly related to the work that volunteers are doing. Also, it's not that volunteers are doing work that has no cost associated with it. And we need to rethink the narrative around that moving forward.
Okay, there was a question that just came in that's kind of a follow-up to your comment about board members, Bruce, and I just want to ask this question here. So Christina's asking, what are the top 3 questions nonprofit board of directors should be asking about volunteering in their organizations? And how do we increase the visibility of volunteering on a board of directors radar as a strategic issue?
So how do we raise it on the board at a strategic issue? I have an answer to that piece. What was the first part of the question, Meredith? Can you repeat that?
What are the top 3 questions that nonprofit board of directors should be asking about volunteering in their organization? So what is, I guess, the most important information that a board should know about volunteering?
I think it's important to understand the ways that volunteers are contributing to service delivery or to the core function or mission of the organization. So I think often we talk about it when we think about labor market or workforce issues, we often or frequently we might marginalize the role of volunteers. So I think it's important to share a balanced perspective on the work that staff are doing and the contributions that volunteers are making, and to be able to speak to the trends and the issues across both of those ends of that equation. So I would say that's one issue, is really be able to high level or bottom line what the contribution that volunteers are making to your core mission, understand how that connects to your workforce planning and your workforce strategy. And then also be able to speak to the challenges and opportunities from a volunteer management perspective at a strategic level. So not just the task focused or the tactical pieces, but link it to the strategy and link it to the impacts and the outcomes of the organization.
Amazing. And we've got a couple more questions come in about kind of internal processes when it comes to volunteers and how to manage those. So we got a question from Michael today that says, I've spoken to many not-for-profits that do not use volunteers because of the human resources burden of managing them. How can these not-for-profits acquire volunteers without feeling that HR burden?
I don't think you can. I think you need to invest in doing this well. And you need to hire expertise, and it costs money. So I don't think you can do it for nothing. Sorry.
Can I add a yes and on that? Yes,
Sure.
but that doesn't have to mean that you'd go alone. It's funny, I was talking to the Volunteer Center of Lethbridge just a week or so ago, and they've created kind of a community model to have like a shared service model for volunteer screening. So to Megan's point, you got to do the fundamentals well, but it doesn't mean you have to absorb all of the work or cost on your own. And I think that if one of the things we're seeing towards the tail end of the pandemic and during this period of high cost is organizations are having more conversations about getting together on things that they have shared interests on.
Amazing. People are widely agreeing with you both in the chat, so that's good to see. So we have another question here. We have time for a few more. We've got 5 minutes left, but how can social enterprises play a role in supporting charities and nonprofits volunteer retention and recruitment?
This is the lightning round, Megan.
Yeah, it's getting real fast.
I feel like I don't actually have an answer on that, Meredith. I'm really sorry. I can't, what I love about what social enterprise is doing, and I see it all the time, is that they're coming up with creative solutions to the problems that exist in communities and in society. And I, since I've started in my role, I have wondered what the connection is on some of this stuff, but I haven't drawn the line yet, Meredith. Sorry, Bruce, maybe you've got the connection point there.
No, I don't. I think it's a great question, and it really got me thinking. And I'm not sure I have a top of mind response that is good.
Here is what I do say, though. I do say that that if we rethink our entire narrative around volunteering, and if we think about it as individuals want to solve social problems or economic or environmental or health problems, if we have an innate desire to solve problems, how can we think about volunteers as the social change, not just as this output or as this kind of byproduct of the work we do, but think about how can we tap into individuals' innate desire to do good and harness that in ways that make a difference in your community. So that is the only thing that I would say that I believe in fully that answers that question.
Yeah, amazing. And then that one, I mean, it kind of dovetails into this next question a little bit, where we have somebody asking if you have any tips for capturing potential volunteers that may seem interested, they are in touch with you, they attend your information sessions, but then they never actually follow through and apply.
Yeah, I think it's about relationship building, tips around that. I think, persistence matters. We solve more problems through conversation than we do by just kind of like, ignoring it or not talking about it. And so I think people's lives are complex, and we can't assume that there's a reason why they're not showing up, or that there's some, I just think the complexity, that's the other piece in the pandemic. People reprioritized, people's lives have become complex. And let's be real, there are days where you're going to show up and be an awesome volunteer, and there's days where you're not going to be able to do it. And we have to be able to figure out robust and meaningful solutions that support people where they're at and engage them where they're at, not expect them to sort of fit the round peg square hole thing.
Great. And we've talked a lot on this call about resources, and we've mentioned a few, and we're going to put as many as we can in the follow-up email, because I know we've been getting a ton of questions about them. But we had somebody ask, what is the best resource for better understanding the legal requirements related to volunteer management?
Ooh, great. I would just direct people to places like the Canadian Code for Volunteer Involvement, our screening handbook, our screening guidelines. We have a ton of resources on our website, and take a look through some of those, reach out, and we're happy to answer questions from anybody on this call or anybody who has a question around this work. And there's great resources in communities and volunteer managers, and Volunteer Management Professionals of Canada is another great resource that I would give a quick shout out to. I can't give enough shout outs to all the great folks in communities across the country who are doing great work to lift this issue up and to ensure that the work's done really well and thoughtfully and in ways that manage risk. And a big thank you to Imagine and Keela to having us on today.
Yeah, okay, amazing. Thank you. I'm going to close it. We have one more question. So what would be your #1 priority in a national action strategy for volunteerism?
Fund the work, fund it. We gotta ask for funding for this work, core funding, core stable, long-term funding. We can't do this on nothing. It doesn't work. We gotta get resources to make it happen. And we gotta do it together. It has to be done together. There's not just one voice. It's gotta be reflective of everyone's voices in this conversation.
Agreed. And Bruce, I don't know if you had one final thought on that question.
I just want to I just want to say thank you for putting together this opportunity. This has just been I can feel the energy on this just through the questions and the chat. So thanks to everybody for attending. Thanks, Keela and Megan. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and wisdom. And it's clear there's many folks, the Volunteer Center Network, who are on here, and those are amazing resources and communities.
Yeah, big thank you to Keela and to you, Imagine, for having the conversation. And for everyone's excitement on the call. Yeah.
Yes, this was amazing. Okay, we are at time, so that concludes the session for today. But thank you again so much to Bruce and Megan for bringing such amazing insights today. Before we go, I just want to let everybody know that there will be a very short survey that will pop up right after this session. It should only take you about 20 seconds to complete. So we would greatly appreciate hearing your feedback. Our next Keelabs webinar is called Nonprofit Leadership Hacks for Breakthrough Growth in 2023 with Branch's Mission Labs, and it is taking place on March 15th. And Kim is going to put the link to register in the chat, so I hope you can all come and check that out. And that is it. Thank you again, Bruce and Megan. Thank you to everybody on the call. We hope to see you at the next Keelabs webinar. Bye.